Just give one.
Right. All right. Oh, this
You
is
have a
me.
face shield?
Well, there's one here.
Yeah, that
Would
one's
you
pretty
prefer that?
Yeah, so we can see your face.
You mind if I turn off this front row lights?
I don't at all. Appreciate it.
Somebody get
How's
that
that?
door.
I'm sure you're all protected now. All right, let's see, I need to. Can you hear me in the back? Is this is broadcast, so I will use this then. So we're going to take a look at evolution. We're going to take a look at this question: great leaps in evolution. Did Darwin get it right? So that's where we are headed for today. So I'm going to introduce a couple of Darwin's most significant ideas. Of course, the first was common ancestry, that species are not completely separate creations, but rather have arisen from shared ancestors in the past. So we have these two butterfly species, and Darwin's model of change suggested that these two species evolved from a common ancestor. Just like siblings arise from common set of parents, cousins arise from common sets of grandparents, and so forth. And his first rendition of this tree of life is presented here in his notebook from 1837. That's his, and he's got his little "I think" up in the corner there. That's his actual little notebook, and he's showing that from a common ancestor, living species with those letters have arisen, and that there are also extinct species that left no descendants. And this model of the relationship among all of life has been substantiated by genetic analysis. So what we see here is a modern rendition from really the late 1980s, early 1990s that have since been confirmed by subsequent analyses, showing that not just butterflies are descended from previous living butterflies, but that butterflies and all insects are descended from ancestral insects, and all of life, all of animals are descended from ancestral animals and are related to plants and fungi, and all other eukaryotes, all other organisms that have nuclei and mitochondria and chloroplasts, little organelles within their cells, and that they are related by common ancestry to bacteria. These two clades or groups or branches of organisms, the true bacteria and then the archaeans, are two groups of organisms that have cells. They're single-celled, and their cells lack nuclei. Really, one of the great revelations of modern genetic analysis revealed, as we talked 2 weeks ago, some of the most impressive conclusions from science are those that reject or refute our kind of common knowledge, are based on simple observation. Probably when you folks were in high school, certainly when I was in high school, I learned that all of these single-celled organisms that lack nuclei were in one kingdom, suggesting they were all related more closely to one another than to anything else. And then you have the eukaryotes, animals, plants, and fungi, and amoeba, things with nuclei. They're all more closely related to one another than to anything else. Well, as you can see from this genetic analysis, actually, this group of single-celled anucleate, or cells without a nucleus, single-celled life forms, are more closely related to the nucleated eukaryotes than to other bacteria, than to other anucleate cells. So genetic analysis revealed something surprising.
Going to find
Zoom, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I just need my next slide. All right. This notion of common ancestry explains a lot of observable phenomena in nature. This is how Darwin explained the available data, the available patterns that we can all observe in nature. One of them being homologies. Now, homologies are structures which appear different on the outside and are used for different functions, like a bat's wing and a whale's flipper and a human hand that's used for grasping, and cat and dog legs that are used for running. But when you peel the skin and the muscle off of those bones, what you find is that underneath, they're composed of the same bones. And Darwin, from his creationist perspective, because he was born in England in 1809, I mean, that's what his philosophical, cultural perspective was. He was wondering why these organisms that lead such different lives would have been created with this underlying similarity. He viewed this as a limitation of design. Why does the smallest mammal on the planet in Thailand, the bumblebee bat, it's an inch long, flies through the air? What engineer would ever create this animal using the same rubric, the same rules of construction as they would use to build the largest animal that's ever lived that swims through the water? A second observable pattern are vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures that are found in a given species but serve no function in that species, but are found in other species where they do serve a function. So whales, which don't have any legs, have hip bones. What the heck are they doing with hip bones if they don't have any legs connected to those hip bones? Why do half the mammals on the planet, let's call them males, have nipples that don't function? Why are there these imperfections of design? Darwin appreciated that there were correlations with the environment, that homologous structures, yes, they have this similar underlying structure, but they're used for different purposes in different environments. So we have a correlation. Different environments, different functions. There are other organisms and other structures that are called analogous structures. These are similar in function in the same environment, but they're built in completely different ways out of completely different structures. So for instance, we've got a bird's wing where, when you eat a chicken wing, the part you're holding on to is its hand. And those digits are fused early in development and create that nice little handle for you to hold. The wing proper are just feathers. A bat's wing has really long digits that actually support the membrane. So you might say, well, they're both built out of kind of the forelimbs, but actually the wing itself is constructed from completely different structures. And then finally, let's think of the animals that there are more of than any other type on the planet, are insects. They have wings too, but no limbs are involved in their wings, and they've got extra legs. They got 6 legs, and they don't even use any of them for their wings. Their wings are outpocketings of their exoskeleton. And as different as these structures are in terms of what they're built from, they have to serve the same physical function. They're constrained by the physics of flight. Something that's going to be used as, that's going to function as a wing has to generate lift. And to generate lift, even like the wing of an airplane, it has to, in cross-section, be an airfoil, so that air moving across the top of the wing moves more rapidly and under lower pressure than air moving across the bottom of the wing. With lower pressure on the top of the wing, the wing is pushed up. You can appreciate that pretty easily with a bat's wing and a bird's wing, because the leading edge is the limb itself, which is going to be thicker than the thin membrane trailing behind, or the wings, the feathers trailing behind. You might think that an insect's wing is just this little paddle and they're flapping like crazy, but that's not gonna, a little paddle's not gonna generate lift. It has to be an airfoil. And actually, if you take an insect's wing and you cut it in cross section, you see these veins that run the length of the wing. Those veins are out of plane with one another, so that the membrane, the veins are here at where you see the bend in the membrane. What we end up creating then across the entire length of the wing is an airfoil, thicker at the front than at the back, because the veins at the front of the wing are out of plane with one another, creating a bump in the front of the wing. Again, a correlation with the environment. Here we have different structures converging on a similar function that's used in similar environments. Now, of course, the very process of science that we talked about 2 weeks ago involves describing patterns of causality in nature. And what we do is we look at lots of variables that correlate, that happen at the same time, and we try and figure out, well, which of these things that's happening at this given moment are causing a change in our subject of interest? What are the causal relationships? So Darwin simply applies a scientific approach to these patterns and asks, gee, could these correlated patterns be causal? Could the environment somehow cause these patterns? Could different environments cause similar things to become different over time? And could a common environment cause different things to become similar? And as a consequence of these observations, he develops his mechanism of how the changes necessarily implied by common ancestry. How do we get so many different things if everything is descended from a common ancestral form? How do differences arise? He promotes this hypothesis of how differences could arise. This hypothesis developed as a consequence. Nothing works in a nothing happens in a vacuum. Nothing develops. No ideas develop in a vacuum. As you'll see, Darwin read Thomas Malthus, a preeminent economist of his day, and Malthus wrote Essay on the Principle of Population in 1798. And in this book, he describes how all populations have the capacity to over-reproduce. Every pair of reproducing individuals on the planet, whether they be beetles or birds or humans, have the capacity to produce more than just 2 offspring. Have the capacity to produce more offspring than will replace them in the population when they die. So if you produce more than 2 offspring, you're contributing to a net increase in the population even after you leave. All populations have the capacity to over-reproduce, but resources are finite. There's only so much arable land on the planet. So what's going to happen is populations are going to increase exponentially until they reach or are limited by some resource they require. Could be food, could be nest sites. And at that point, there will be a struggle for existence. Most offspring that are born are going to die before they reach reproductive age. And Malthus is developing these ideas in 1798. He's in England. He's an English member of the English aristocracy. He's looking across the English Channel. 10 years before, all his buddies in the French aristocracy had their heads cut off because the French people revolted because one reason was because they were starving. You know, and then the apocryphal saying of Marie Antoinette, well, you know, let them eat cake. If they don't have any bread, let them eat cake. People that are starving, you know, maybe they don't have quite the same sense of humor as everybody else, so they whack her head off. Malthus is sitting there in England, an island nation. Talk about appreciating the limitations of available farmland. And he's like, this is not good. This is not a good scenario. Well, Darwin, after returning from his voyage of the Beagle and considering these ideas and correlations in his autobiography, writes in October 1838, 15 months after I'd begun my systematic inquiry, I happened to read for amusement, just reading economics for amusement, on Malthus on population and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence, which everywhere goes on from long continued observation of the habits of animals and plants. It at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The result of this would be the formation of new species. Here then I had last got a theory by which to work. And so really the hypothesis of natural selection is built on this Malthusian foundation. And to this foundation, Darwin recognized, having been an avid beetle collector and naturalist during his lifetime, that even among beetles in one particular species, there's individual variation. And that some of that variation is heritable. He didn't understand genetics at all, but he could see that offspring looked like their parents. There were heritable characteristics. So, as his autobiography attests, he recognized that as a result of this variation, some organisms will be more likely to survive and reproduce and pass on these characteristics that work well in that environment. There will be differential reproductive success. Some organisms will reproduce more than others and thus pass on those characteristics. And then a population then will change over time as adaptive traits accumulate. And two populations of the same species in different environments will be selected for different traits. What works well in this place might not be the same thing that works well over there. This population is selected for large size. This population is selected for small size. The populations diverge to the point where they may not be able to reproduce with one another again, and we would recognize them then as new, different forms of life, new, different species. And he ends The Origin of Species with this probably most prosaic passage in all of the great works of science. I'll let you just read that. What's emphasized in blue are allusions to physics, the laws acting around us. Because at this point in time, biology is not a natural science. Biology is part of theology. It's studying the natural world and cataloging nature in order to learn more about the Creator. But by connecting and suggesting that biology has its own natural laws that can be studied through science, just like physics and the laws of physics acting around us just like the laws that govern planetary motion, we can study biology as a science as well. And here we now have a hypothesis, which now, having been tested, is a theory of how biological change occurs. An important element of Darwin's ideas was that this change that occurs in biological systems, if it is indeed a natural law akin to other natural laws like gravity or patterns of natural processes like in geology, like mountain building or erosion, that this process of evolution would occur at a slow and stately rate, at a uniform rate. It was an idea that had been laid down by the early geologists, by James Hutton, who lived in the 1700s. He was the first to propose that the Earth is far older than we can imagine. He did this because he looked at Hadrian's Wall that runs along northern England. And he knew that it had been constructed in 122 AD, 1600 years before. He's looking at this wall that's 1600 years old, built during the reign of Hadrian, for which we have a written record. We know when it was built in human history. And it looks like the rocks have been hewn yesterday. And then he looks at the barren outcrops behind him, and he sees how worn they are by erosion. And he's like, well, these rocks that were hewn 1600 years ago show no sign of erosion. These natural outcrops are worn smooth. How much older must they be to have been worn smooth by the erosive forces that in 1600 years had almost no effect on Hadrian's Wall? How long must it take for the White Cliffs of Dover, composed of tiny, tiny little calcium carbonate shells, of microscopic photosynthetic marine organisms, how long must it have taken to accumulate sedimentary deposits hundreds of feet deep? Well, when we observe sedimentation today, it happens really slowly. When we observe erosion today, it happens really slowly. If these are natural processes that occur at natural rates, and these are the rates, then they would have happened slowly in the past as well, and the Earth must be extraordinarily old. The preeminent geologist during Darwin's lifetime was Charles Lyell. In fact, he wrote 3 volumes of the Principles of Geology, which were used up until the 1900s. That's how formative they were. And they were based on this idea of uniformitarianism, that nature works by constant laws that operate at a slow and steady pace. And so Darwin's kind of scientific philosophy was grounded in this idea.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I want to correct the dates on Charles Lyell.
What are they? Oh, yeah. It's 1885. That's right. Yeah, that's a neat trick. 1885.
Okay.
Thank you. So we see in Origin of Species, Darwin writing, natural selection can act only by the preservation and accumulation of infinitesimally small inherited modifications, each profitable to the preserved being. And as modern geology has almost banished such views as the excavation of a great valley by a single diluvial wave, so will natural selection, if a continued creation of new, or if it be a true principle, banish the belief of the continued creation of new organic forms or of any great and sudden modifications in their structure. So he is representing natural selection as a slow and steady natural process, gradual process where change occurs through slow and steady accumulation of small changes. So we can summarize to this point the importance of competition among individuals competing for limited resources as the spur of evolutionary innovation by a gradual stepwise process. Well, we've done a lot of science since 1859. His ideas of common ancestry and gradual change have certainly been supported for the most part. So we've got transitional fossils that link the lobe-finned fishes, of which there are still some representatives. The coelacanth and lungfishes have bones in their fin as opposed to just having little cartilaginous rays like bass and trout. They actually have a shoulder girdle. And the bones in that shoulder girdle are just like the bones that you've got in your arm. And in fact, that's where they came from. And we have a very nice sequence of transitional fossils through the earliest stages of colonization of land by our first amphibians, the transition from fish to amphibians. We also have an extraordinarily complete transitional sequence between reptiles and mammals. So what we're looking at here are the jaw bones, the lower jaw, the mandible, of different fossils along this lineage, from reptiles like our old pelycosaur, sail-finned reptile, which, like all other reptiles, including those today, have a mandible composed of multiple bones. The dentary is this white bone here in which the teeth are nested, hence the name dentary. But then there are also these other bones which are fused together, much like the bones of your skull fuse together, but they fuse together to form the lower jaw. Our jaw and the jaws of all existing mammals is composed of just the dentary, just that white bone. Where'd all the other bones go? That's where they went. What we see in the evolution of mammals through their therapsid intermediates is a reduction in all those other bones and a dominance of the dentary. And where did those other bones go? They all just were reduced in size at the back of the jaw. And they actually became the middle ear bones that anvil the stapes and the stirrup, that transmit vibrations from the eardrum to the cochlea, which is the actual organ of the inner ear, where hairs vibrate, and those vibrations are perceived by neurons that are interpreted by your brain as sound. That's so transitional fossils. Yeah, we've got them, and it looks pretty strong evidence. So, see, I'm right. So what's up? What am I going to talk about for the next 15 minutes? I thought I was going to say Darwin was wrong somewhere along the line. Well, let's take a look at those major innovations. So, this is kind of interesting to think about. Origin of life, oldest fossils we have, 3.5 billion years old. They're bacterial. The first eukaryotic cells we see, those things with nuclei like our cells and cats and even amoeba, the first eukaryotes we see don't show up in the fossil record to about 2 billion years ago. So for half of life's history, life on our planet was exclusively bacteria. Now those bacteria, if you remember from that phylogeny, from that tree of life, boy, there sure were a lot of them, those two big branches. Those are all those different bacteria. They were radiating and diversifying, and have radiated and diversified for twice the amount of time as anything else. So we get a bigger spread to that tree. And they were radiating metabolically. So photosynthesis evolved in the bacteria. Aerobic respiration evolved in the bacteria. Different bacteria evolving these different metabolic pathways. All right, that's interesting. Where did the eukaryotes come from? Did they arise through some stepwise process of slowly accumulating these characteristics we see in our cells? Well, in 1960s, Lynn Margulis suggested, no, I don't think it happened that way. She saw that mitochondria, where aerobic respiration occurs in our cells, and chloroplasts, where photosynthesis occurs in plants, or multicellular photosynthetic organisms, that those organelles have their own DNA. That's weird. Why do they need DNA? I've got DNA in my own cell. Why does that mitochondria need its own DNA? And that DNA, well, she suggested that these little organelles had been free-living bacteria at one time, and that the evolution of eukaryotic cells came about by some bacteria engulfing these other bacteria, but instead of eating them, instead of digesting them, partnering with them. And instead of just chewing away at that photosynthetic bacterium and getting one meal, they harbored that photosynthetic bacterium and fed off the sugars that photosynthetic bacterium made. This is called the endosymbiotic theory. And when we do the genetic test, that hypothesis was confirmed. The DNA in the mitochondria in your cells, so not in the 46 chromosomes that are in the nucleus of your cell, but in the hundreds of little mitochondria that are in your cells that are actually performing aerobic respiration and using oxygen to break your food down, the DNA in those mitochondria is more similar to the DNA in bacteria, more similar to the DNA in the bacteria on this table than it is to the DNA in that very same cell in your nucleus. DNA similarity implies common ancestry. That's why you're similar to your sibling. You got your DNA from the same place. Now, her idea was laughed at. It was scoffed at. You're saying that these cells, these free-living bacteria and these other free-living bacteria partnered together as opposed to competed? That's an anti-Darwinian view of nature. And she was ridiculed until about a decade later, those genetic tests proved her right. What's the next greatest stage in evolution? Well, these are all just single-celled bacteria working on their own. The first eukaryotes, single-celled eukaryotic cells, trying to make it on their own. Individuality. About billion to 700 million years ago, we see multicellular life. We see cells joining together. This happens first in the algae. And we still see that represented by different forms of algae today. There are single-celled algae. There are colonial algae that just gain a benefit by being bigger. So, they're not as easy to eat. Fewer predators can eat them because they're clumped up. And then the next benefit of working together is there can be a division of labor. And if you're grouped up with a bunch of other cells, and each one is trying to do everything a cell needs to do to survive, you can say, man, this is just too tough. I'm trying to do this, that, and the other thing. How about I do this and you do that and you do the other thing? And by specializing in division of labor, we'll all appreciate how Henry Ford made an assembly line and increased productivity by dividing up the responsibilities, increasing the productivity of the entire entity. Multicellularity allows for division of labor and cell specialization, but it also then creates dependencies. Your lungs are doing one thing. They can't get along without your circulatory system or your digestive system. These are partnerships that allow for division of labor, cell specialization, increased productivity. What are cancers? Cancers are cells that go rogue. I don't need y'all. I'm going to steal the energy and I'm just going to divide. I'm not going to specialize into whatever tissue I'm supposed to be. And I'm going to starve that organ of what it needs. And I don't care if I take the whole thing down with me. It reminds me of the Scorpion and the fox crossing the stream. Scorpion says, please give me a ride across the stream. The fox is like, you're going to stab me, you know, forget it. And finally the scorpion convinces him, and halfway across the stream, the scorpion stabs him. The fox is like, what are you doing? You're killing us both. He goes, it's my nature. That's the nature of a cancer cell. Takes this whole system down. Colonization of land by plants. Algae are the ancestors of plants. Plants are terrestrial photosynthetic organisms. Just like whales, some have returned to an aquatic lifestyle, but plants have their origin on land. And then that occurred about 400 million years ago. And how did it occur? It really occurred because of a partnership between photosynthetic plants and fungi in the soil. Fungi are much more like animals. Fungi don't photosynthesize. They excrete digestive enzymes and then absorb the products of that external digestion. So you roll a log over and there's these little white threads underneath. They're excreting enzymes that are breaking that wood down into sugars. And then they're absorbing the sugars. Then they're absorbing the nutrients and the nitrogen and the phosphates in the soil. Well, through there, and water, by networking with fungal networks throughout the soil, plants gain this huge absorptive surface provided by the fungi. And this partnership can absorb a whole lot more water and a whole lot more soil nutrients. And the photosynthetic plant can give more sugars to the fungi than they could produce themselves. And that allows these symbiotic relationships to benefit both partners. It's not just true of plants. All animals, including us, have bacteria, not just in our gut, but also throughout the rest of our bodies. And these bacteria are interacting with our own cells. You actually have 10 times more bacterial cells in your body than human cells. And they are interacting in complex ways. Epinephrine, produced by the nervous system, has an effect on those bacteria. Those bacteria are producing tripeptides that has an effect on our circulation. That's why, you eat yogurt, I get good microbiota in me, because that we are a community. Each one of us is not a single entity, not just a single entity composed of human cells that become specialized through division of labor for increasing productivity. We have partnered with other organisms to the mutual benefit of both. And of course, we can think of social systems. One-on-one, lion versus hyena, lion's gonna win. 4-on-1, 4 hyenas versus a lion, hyena's gonna win. Partnering is a social group, benefits all. In fact, Darwin was well aware of this. He couldn't understand how sterility in a beehive could be selected for. You got one reproductive individual, a queen, and all the other workers are females. Workers are all females. The drones, the males, they're tolerated for a little while, but then they're kicked out of the hive. All the workers are females. Why won't those workers reproduce on their own? Why are they helping their mom produce sisters? And that isn't just kind of an interesting thing, but if selection operates as a consequence of differential reproductive success, if the bottom line is reproduction, how can this system, where most of the organisms are not reproducing, actually persist through time? Darwin hated bees. He was well aware. He was well aware of this. Well, let's go to trees. Dr. Suzanne Simard of University of British Columbia recognized that as a consequence of trees being connected to these underground fungal networks through which they shunt nutrients, they can actually share nutrients from one tree to another that are connected to the same underground fungal system. And they do. Injected radioisotopes into this individual tree, those radioisotopes end up showing up in other trees around that one tree. They are sharing nutrients below ground, different individual trees. They are also perceiving defensive chemicals. So when a tree has an infestation of some herbivorous insect and the insects are eating on the leaves, they release chemicals that they're using to defend themselves against those insects. But some of those chemicals are airborne and they float into the stomata, into the leaves of other trees in the neighboring area. And those trees start to produce their defensive chemicals before they're even damaged. Trees talk to one another. And this is occurring not just between members of an individual tree family, not even just between members of the same species. It's happening between individuals of different species. The forest is protecting itself as a community. There are mother trees, mature trees that have the largest network with these underground mycorrhizal fungi, and they're connected to the most, they really form this mat, and then new seedlings that drop in that soil set out their roots and they end up connecting to this network. It's already established. And they get fed by this mature tree that has a surplus of sugars that they're passing down to their roots and form this huge underground network. This says this is most important in dry climates, that sustenance that they're providing to these very vulnerable little saplings, that becomes all the more important in environments that are stressful, where you need that extra little help. For plants, that's going to be environments that are dry. It's going to be environments that are hot. It's going to be environments of the future due to climate change. This is going to affect how we do tree harvest. You want to go down, you want to go in and clear cut. You clear cut all the trees down. There's nobody contributing to the underground mycorrhizal network. You leave mature trees. You leave those mother trees, seedlings have a better chance of growing and establishing once they tap into those networks. So above ground, we have plants competing for light. When I was in graduate school, I had lots of friends who were looking at competition among plants. What were they looking at? Competition for light above ground. Below ground, however, something else is happening. They're sharing of resources. When resources are limiting, partnerships rather than individual competition can be selected for. We've got a grizzly here, and that grizzly is going to be driven off that elk carcass by this pack of wolves. Darwin recognized the social benefits that are attributed to individuals. He recognized that. He wrote books on evolution of sociality, the benefits to individuals of being in a society. But why was there such an emphasis for him on competition among individuals as the driving force for evolutionary innovation, as opposed to cooperation? Well, I think it's appropriate to think of this social context. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. There were rebellion in the streets by Marxists and Unionists. It was a dynamic foment of ideas. He saw, and in fact, many people have even suggested that Adam Smith's ideas of organism, individual humans, working in their self-interest, competition, drives industrial innovation, that these ideas seeped into Darwin's milieu as well. It's probably absolutely true. Of course, we have these cultural ideas of competition as masculine and cooperation as feminine. We have stepwise progress versus revolutionary change. There are lots of cultural reasons that correlate, we'll leave it at that correlate with the preeminence that Darwin places on competition as a spurred innovation rather than cooperation. But it is kind of interesting that it has been two women who have highlighted the remarkable importance of cooperative relationships in important evolutionary events in the history of life. But you know, we got to cut Darwin a little slack. I mean, he did come up with some really incredible ideas, although he didn't come up with all the ideas. His major contributions, in large part, have been confirmed by the fossil record, by genetic analysis. He didn't explain everything. Well, he didn't know about genetics. He didn't know about the structure and function of mitochondria and chloroplasts. He didn't know about mycorrhizal fungi. So the fact that he had no explanation for those is really me just using him as a straw man to create a cute little title to get you to come to him. But we all know that even in competitive markets, driven by self-interest and the invisible hand, that partnerships can provide that competitive edge. We can win in a competitive marketplace by partnering with other entities to gain a competitive advantage. So you want a Coke at Burger King? No, we just have Pepsi. You want a Pepsi at McDonald's? No, we just have Coke. And that is where we'll end. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Few minutes for questions. I know y'all want to have him go on and on. This is fascinating. Let me get another mic. I guess it'll work with two mics going on at the same time. Questions? Or did he answer them all? This is amazing.
Yes.
I've been reading about, in recent years, about how forests are all interconnected underground.
Right.
And that's quite a revolutionary new understanding for me. Now, what about when we have these major forest fires, which kill everything above ground?
Right.
What's happening underground? Will that eventually restore? And
Yeah, it will. Oftentimes what you have then is, in fact, many plants have adapted to exploit a period directly after fire. So we need only go to the coastal plain of South Carolina here. We have longleaf pine communities. Longleaf pine have a growth form that's really weird. The branches are really thick, providing fewer kind of small branches that would start a fire. When you want to start a fire, you start with little twigs. They don't have any little twigs. Their branches are really thick. They have cones that only open, that are glued shut with their pine resin. And they only open after a fire goes through and melts that wax. And then the cones open and the seeds pop out. The reason being that this is adaptive, gives them a reproductive advantage, is that fires contribute ash to a soil, which is a natural fertilizer. The nitrogen and the phosphorus get contributed to the soil. And also with the burning off of that canopy and the above ground biomass, all those branches, you're in full sun and you've got a soil that's rich in nutrients. What a great time to get started as a young seedling. So we're learning that even here,